lot of things throughout my life, primarily teaching. But when I got to college, I went in as a global affairs and chemistry major. And I dropped the global affairs pretty quickly, and within a year I dropped the chemistry and decided to do physics. But the whole time I was taking German classes. So from 6th grade all the way through college, I was I was in German classes because I'm from Wisconsin, and so they have this as part of the curriculum. You're able to choose German, French, or Spanish. I happened to have a great German teacher, and so I stuck with it pretty much the whole time. I was at Yale, I was doing physics, and there happened to be this guy named Josh Price who was teaching Yiddish classes, and it was in the German department, so I took it. Turns out Josh Price was a fellow at the Yiddish Book Center, which is the position that I now hold. And he was just so great. I loved Yiddish so much. I ended up applying to programs in, I applied to the Oxford Yiddish Studies Master's Program, and I applied to 2 PhD programs in physics. And I was accepted to Oxford first, and I just said yes. I later found out that I had been rejected from both of the physics PhD programs. So the universe decided for me on that one. At the same time, at the beginning of my Yale experience, there's a thing called first year seminars. So all the first years get to choose some kind of fun class. There's one that was like about Walden, and you just go on walks in the woods and write poetry, I guess. And there are there are a lot of different things that are kind of about politics or urban planning, or just pick what you want. I happened to get into my first choice seminar, which was called Art of the Printed Word, which was a letterpress printing class. So through the course of that, you learn how to do letterpress printing. You work in a shop in the basement of one of the colleges, and you look at books from the archives. It's a really great way to get to know like the library system. And I totally fell in love with that as well. I ended up printing 6 editions of a book that I made called Famous Bowtie Wearers. Of course, I was the last person in the book. And so yeah, that's kind of how I got into letterpress. I was doing Yiddish. When I went to Oxford, there was a class called Paleography, History of the Book, and Digital Humanities. And we were allowed to choose, I had my Yiddish courses, and then I was allowed to choose a method option, so I chose this one. That leads me into what this presentation is about, because this research was done as part of that class for my paper, which happened to be on this book. So you may know book historians tend to just take their students and be like, wow, look at this archive, go find a book and write about it. And this has happened to me twice in my life already, where people have just kind of sicked me on the library. So my professor, Henrika Leinemann, who's a German medievalist, she studies nuns, she does Latin Compline in the crypt. She's a very fun person, but she was she's the leader of this class, and so I came in knowing German, knowing Yiddish, and I said I really want to examine a Yiddish book, because Oxford has a great collection of Yiddish books that of course survived the Nazis because they were in Britain. So they have a really marvelous collection, specifically of old Yiddish publications. So this is, I chose this book. I fell in love with it. At first sight, I just kind of like checked out a bunch of books, and I went to the reading room, and this was the one I fell in love with at first sight, and I'll tell you why later. But the point of this class and the point of this project was to engage with the materiality of the book, and to understand or to investigate how the physicality and materiality of the book say something about the culture that created it. So whether that's economic or social, how is that feeding into the actual production of the book and going beyond just the content of the book. So this talk is basically everything I learned about this specific book, which is a Haggadah from 1609, printed in Venice, and I found that I could understand a lot of the assumptions and the values of the time based on just looking at the typography and the materiality. So, without much further ado, oh, I can't get this. Oh, exciting. Okay. So it says Siman L'Seder Shel Presentatia. Usually it says Siman L'Seder Shel Pesach, which is Pesach Passover. So this is the order of my presentation. I have the introduction to Yiddish, the language, introduction to Haggadah history, Giovanni Digara, the printer of this book. Then I get into the book itself, and I've promised you architecture, and I will give you architecture, looking at the letter forms, the mapping of the book, imagery within the book, some interesting things and technology that hopefully you all will start using, because it's great. The materiality, and then I will talk about the digital edition that I created of this book, which included transcription and XML encoding. So, first off, what is Yiddish? Do we have, how much do we know about Yiddish?
You must know about Yiddish.
Yeah, just a little. Yeah.
I know about Yiddish.
You know about Yiddish?
Yeah.
Yiddish? Okay. Just things that you need to know for this specific presentation. Yiddish is the vernacular of Ashkenazic Jews. It is comprised of, it's most closely related to Middle High German. This is its common ancestor with modern German. It's about 1,000 years old, and it's comprised of several different types of words that come from different components, or from different languages, basically. So there are Germanic words. So I've written here, ich wohne in mein Bobes Dira. So ich wohne in mein is all coming from Germanic. Boba comes from Slavic, it means grandmother, and Dira means apartment, and it comes from the Semitic component. So this means I live in my grandmother's house. And so every sentence in Yiddish will usually have a lot of different components. That's something to be aware of. Yiddish also historically has had an association with the feminine. So Yiddish is known as the Mama Lushan. This is, the mother tongue, or maybe the tongue that your mother speaks. Often early books would be specifically targeted toward female audiences. So books that were translated into Yiddish or written in Yiddish were about women's rules within Judaism. So like rules about ritual purity, menstruation, things like that. Some books are even say inside of them, this book is written for women and men who are like women in that they don't read Hebrew. What does that mean? Hebrew was the language of the yeshiva, the cheder, right? These boys would go and they would learn the Torah, so they would learn to read Hebrew. I don't know what this is. I'm going to sneeze it. So Yiddish has this kind of connotation as a women's language, and Hebrew is the kind of the holy tongue. What is a Haggadah? So a Haggadah is a type of prayer book. It is the book that you use for Passover, which celebrates the Jews' exodus, celebrates the right word, but memorializes the Jews' exodus, or the Israelites' exodus from slavery in Egypt. And a Haggadah is basically the step-by-step guide, all the prayers you have to say, and some other fun stuff, commentary on Exodus, and also like songs and telling you when to drink wine and such. So that is what this type of book is. It's a book that's meant to be used at one of these seders. A brief history of illustrated Haggadot. I brought some examples. So Haggadot were originally manuscripts. So this is a reproduction of the Sarajevo Haggadah, which is a famous manuscript Haggadah. And I'll just for examples of what, I didn't know who exactly the audience would be, but I took these from the Yiddish Book Center. These are just Haggadahs that are used nowadays. There's one from like Winn-Dixie and one from Publix. They're kind of just for a sense of what Haggadahs look like. Oops. So yes, Haggadah started as these manuscript things, but the oldest Haggadah that we have that was printed, that was also illustrated, was printed in 1526 in Prague. So that's kind of giving you a bit of a time scale for this. 1526. Also was the first year that Yiddish was printed, rather than just written. So, good times. In 1609 in Venice, Israel Zifroni, a printer, published a Venetian style defining edition. So we published a Haggadah that broadly, was kind of copied within the Venetian milieu. And then in the same year, and in the same city, 1609 in Venice, De Gara prints this Haggadah, which is the one that I'm going to talk about. This is held by the Bodleian, op-ed full 3468. I do have that memorized because I typed it so much. This came out as a series of 3 Haggadot that were meant to cater to the different Jewish communities within Venice. So there was one that was printed in Judeo-German, which is Yiddish. There's one printed in Judeo-Spanish, or Ladino, and then there's one printed in Judeo-Italian. So it came out as a series. They pretty much look the same, but they have different translations in the margins. So it was an exciting time for printing Haggadot. And then in 1695 in Amsterdam, somebody ripped off the Venetian style, and this Amsterdam Haggadah was very widely imitated, even to this day. Haggadot still look like the one that was published in Amsterdam. So the reason that this book is kind of important in context is that it was born at a time that really influenced the way we make illustrated Haggadot even to this day. So Giovanni De Gara, aside from sharing my name kind of, was very cool because he was considered the heir of Daniel Bomberg. And Daniel Bomberg was a very famous printer. He had these very famous, beautiful letters that he printed with, and people loved him so much that the books would even say, like, oh, these are printed with the letters of Bomberg. Like, if you're using, I believe he actually passed his type to Giovanni De Gara, and so he was using like exactly the same kind of typefaces, but people were really trying to imitate Bomberg because he was seen as this great printer. De Gara was active from 1565 to 1609, so this was one of the last things his house produced, and he worked with the houses of Zanetti and Bragadini. And we can tell this because of the printer's marks that appear in books from this time. I show De Gara's printer's mark, which is the single crown. This was also a time when Jews were not allowed to work at printing presses. Jews were not allowed to share their ideas widely. So people needed a license to publish Jewish books, and this affected the production of the books because you'd have, Jews probably writing the prayers and things and the translations, and then handing it off to a printer. And I don't know if you've ever done letterpress printing, but it's very difficult. You take letter by letter, and especially if you don't know the script, it's incredibly difficult because, even in English, people are putting things upside down all the time. So if you don't even know the script, then you can have all of these typos. So they print, and they hand it back to these Jewish proofreaders who would then make sure all the prayers were correct and everything, which is very important. There is a story of, I can't remember if it was in the De Gara house, I think it was. De Gara did go out of his way to employ Jewish proofreaders, even though they weren't allowed to work with the type. But there was one week where all the Jews were out. I don't know if it was the high holidays or something, but they had so many mistakes in the book because there were no Jews to proofread it that he just, there's an apology in the book that says, I'm so sorry, but all the Jews were gone when we were making this, so we have a lot of mistakes, please excuse them. The way this manifests, of course, in this book physically is that it says, you have to have a license, so they say, con licencia de superiori, to tell the authorities, we have actually printed this. I don't know why people wouldn't have just been able to print that and just say that there was a license, but I don't know.
So, can I just ask you, so Bomberg wasn't Jewish? As far as we know, although being one of the possibly the most famous early printer.
Yeah.
And De Gara, do we know about?
De Gara is not Jewish.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. All these books are being printed by Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You would think they'd make an exception for Hebrew books for Jews. I mean, They did in other phases of life, like kosher butchers.
Mhm.
You could be, you weren't allowed to be a butcher, but you could be a kosher butcher.
Yeah.
If you were Jewish.
And who were the superiors, by the way?
I don't know. I don't know like who was
Yeah.
running Venice at the time.
Okay.
But-
Yeah, I mean, it kind of
Yeah.
reminds me of Roman Catholic books that would have imprimaturs and nihil obstats and imprimi potestes to get them legitimized and avoid the anyone sort of thinking that this is on the Index Prohibitorum.
Yeah. I think. Well, part of the fear is that like if presumably some of these superiori were maybe could read Hebrew because like you have to ensure that the material that's being put out is not I don't know what the right word is in English, like apikoidistic, but for Gentiles.
Renaissance scholars read Hebrew, a lot of them,
Yeah.
and
So.
even in the Catholic Church they read Hebrew because to read the
course.
Old Testament.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So. But yes, you had to give a license to publish any Yiddish or Hebrew book or book in Jewish script. So bad times. There were good times and there were bad times. So I promised you architecture broadly defined. Does anyone want to guess what I'm talking about in terms of architecture? What do you think when I say architecture in terms of a book? What are you thinking?
You're not talking about the letters, right?
The letters, yes. I'm going to say yes to pretty much anything you say because I thought about architecture in many ways for this book. But yeah, I think the page layout, the physical construction of the book. If you were to draw a plan for this, you could do that. But also, literal architecture depicted in the book. So there are these columnar orders. You have your whole thing. You have the column bases that you can actually make the columns taller or shorter based on how many words you want to fit in there, or if you want to put pictures at the bottom. At the bottom there's a picture of Moses, and there's a picture of Aaron, and some other depictions from the Haggadah, the plagues. So lots of fun things going on there, but within the structure of an actual
Is architecture a term of art in your field, or is that a word that you chose?
I'm thinking of it in all English uses.
Just as opposed to design, why would you use architecture rather than design?
It's because I took a classical architecture course and I was very inspired.
Well, I think Martin Antonetti, who was the rare books librarian at Smith for many years, he used to use that fairly typically when he was talking about the structure of a book, and I think he chose it because it unlike other terms, it suggested the tangible, the solid nature, the physicality.
Well, there's another way, right? If you're thinking about iconography, then it's definitely not narrative, it's spatial, because the imagery is, and architecture is a subset of that. It is pointing to space rather than to the text and the narrativity. So is this very typical for the Yiddish Hebrew tradition? Or is this, because I'm thinking about the illustration that Thomas Hobbes himself drew for the Leviathan. And this is literally the demonstration of the argument, like the sum of the argument, which follows the classical rhetorical style of Intramque Parten, where you clearly see sort of two sides. There's always two sides. There's always two figures, there's always two sides. And that, of course, routes back to the Neo-Roman sort of tradition of rhetoric. Is this partition is part of the argument or longer tradition?
What do you mean partition?
Well, there's the left and the right, and there's something in the middle. I obviously I cannot read, but if you think about Hobbes, they keyed it, right? So there are two figures one says liberty, and liberty is very bad, and the other is justice, and that is the order, the Hobbesian sort of order. But you can clearly see that he's replicating Cicero's, argue both sides of the question, right? I mean, the Westminster are two sides across the aisle, so you have to argue both sides of the question. That sort of goes back to Ciceronian tradition of rhetoric.
Yeah. In the Jewish tradition, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of like the actual like construction of the temple or.
But the Talmud is designed like that. So you have the.
Yes, I'm about to get into that. This, images of architecture are not uncommon especially in on like title pages or like the frontispieces of Jewish books will often have actually architecture. So like columns. The most fun one I saw was Solomonic columns, where they're kind of wiggly. I've only ever seen that actually in real life once, which was in Oxford. But they have these columns, and then actually on the inside of that, they write the title and like a description of the book and the author and the printer and whatever. But I think this was the moment in Haggadahs that this kind of thing started happening.
I see.
There's another part in this book where they actually have it's just half and half, and it's not actually two things. Like I'll get into this, but it's the Yiddish that's in the columns and the Hebrew that's in the middle. So it's actually the Yiddish translations are supporting or sheltering the Hebrew, but in the Talmud and also different layouts, there will just be side by side. And actually, if you look at those Haggadot, you'll see they're actually sometimes they'll just put the English on one side and the Hebrew on the other side, or they'll put English Hebrew. But I'll get to that. So I was interested in actually the image of the architecture, the way that you could actually extend the columns and everything. I think that maybe this, I don't have a basis for saying this, but I think that these columns maybe would have been used in other things that were Gentile publications. But the images inside, I do not think would have been used for anything other than specifically a Haggadah, because they're depicting specific things from the text. There's this one is about Pharaoh having spots on him, so it's like these are very specific to the Haggadah. The thing that I was interested in for looking at the architecture of this book is the relationship of Hebrew to Yiddish. As I said, there's this kind of idea that Yiddish is feminine and Hebrew is masculine, but what are the assumptions about Hebrew? What are the assumptions about Yiddish and the readership of Yiddish, the readership of Hebrew? The typography and the page layout reveal a lot about that. They're very closely related to the printer's understanding of their audience and the languages. And there's a great awareness of the languages that people speak, and a self-awareness of the Yiddish language in particular. One of the ways that I analyzed this book was by looking at the typefaces. So there were 3 different typefaces that I found. There was or typeface families. So there's square type. That's the one that you're maybe familiar with from just typical kind of Hebrew books or things. It looks like it's meant to imitate the scribal handwriting. What would like a Sefer Torah look like? There's rabbinic script, which is also known as Rashi script, because the commentaries in the Talmud that are by Rashi are written in this kind of it's meant to imitate handwriting, and it's meant to imitate Sephardic handwriting specifically. And then there's this Yiddish type, which is meant to imitate Ashkenazic handwriting. Now the Yiddish type is called Mashkit or Weiberteich, which, if there's anybody who knows German here,
Women.
Yes, the women's German, right? So it still continues to carry this connotation of being a women's language, even with what this is called. Often because the commentaries, the Bible commentaries for women, would be written in this kind of typeface, or printed in this kind of typeface. So this typeface was almost exclusively used for Yiddish. throughout its history from starting in 1526 with the first Yiddish printing to the mid 19th century, when everybody kind of switched over to square type and rabbinic type for if it's a sefer, if it's like a holy book of some sort. So I looked at where these what these types were and typefaces were and where they appeared. So because I'm interested in Yiddish specifically, I actually collected all of the different letters of Yiddish type and I put them in alphabetical order here so you can look at them and they're so pretty. Anyway, so this Yiddish type I found was used in translations of Hebrew and in captions. There are Hebrew prayers, of course, and then there's Yiddish type, and then the Yiddish type is used to write the Yiddish translations of this Hebrew. But also, the interesting thing is that this is because it appeared in the captions, and it appeared alone in the captions. So Yiddish was used specifically. Yiddish was used alone in the captions, which means that there's an assumption that everybody who's reading this book speaks Yiddish, but not everybody who's reading this book speaks Hebrew, because all of the Hebrew is translated, but not all of the Yiddish is translated. Something that I noted about the production of this book, there was I'll get into this a bit later, but there's a different usage of typeface when there's a Hebrew component word in the Yiddish, but it appears here. So this is chometz, which is the leavened bread that you try to get out of your house during Passover, and they put it in this Hebrew square face up there. But then it appears that they ran out of those letters, so they just ended up converting over to using Yiddish type down there, and actually for the rest of the page when they ran out of those letters. So the red is the same Yiddish type, and the blue is the square type. Another fun thing about this type is that this typeface was not documented before. So discovered a new typeface, just a typical Wednesday. Herbert Zafran wrote an article called Variety in the Typography of Yiddish, which documented a lot of different specifically Vibrotype or Mashkit, Yiddish type faces. And he did not find this, and I show it by showing you the letter Kuf here, which is the one on the right is the one from the book that I was looking at, and from the Haggadah, and these are other Kufs that were used in Venice, but apparently are not the same. So, yay. This is kind of important because typefaces are pretty expensive to produce, to create like a whole font and a whole case. So, yeah. Nice letters. Looking at the next genre, or the next family of type, we have square type. So this was used for the Hebrew core text, so the prayers usually. The woodcuts used a kind of a square version, so when there's a woodcut, this is kind of fun. They actually have little pictures of people inside acting out what part of the Seder that is. So this part of the Seder is Manishtona, which is the 4 questions. And it's where the youngest son usually asks the father, why do we eat matzah during Passover? And this is a depiction actually of the young child asking the father within the capital. Yiddish doesn't have, or Hebrew doesn't have capital letters, but kind of the drop cap. So square type is also used in the Yiddish drop words, as you can see back here. This in the top, it says which is Yiddish, like und, right, it means and, but that's in the square face. And in Hebrew component Yiddish words. So, as I previously mentioned, this is actually all Yiddish, but the blue part is a Hebrew component of the Yiddish language. So it's a word that has derived from Lashon Kodesh, the Holy Tongue, that would be found maybe in the Bible. And so this demonstrates that people actually had an understanding of what parts of the language were from what from what component. So they were not using Yiddish just like kind of randomly and without understanding of where everything came from. When I speak English, I am like never thinking about whether it came from a Romance language or Greek or Latin. But they had a very they were very conscious of what words were from the Holy Tongue, which is, I think, a way to, using this typeface as a way to actually separate out the holy tongue. There's a concept in Yiddish called lahavdil, which is like the separation. So you separate milk and meat, you separate Jews and Gentiles, you also separate the holy from the secular. So you separate the holy tongue from the vernacular. Finally, there's rabbinic type. So rabbinic type was used in the when there are instructions in Hebrew, in the same block as the prayers, and then sometimes because this typeface that they used was actually the font that they used was very small. Sometimes the Yiddish catchwords at the bottoms of the pages were also in this rabbinic type. I did find one mistake where they had a rabbinic type aleph where there should have been a Yiddish type aleph. And I think that's just because somebody put the olive in the wrong drawer, and then they just did it without realizing. So that is a I went through all of the typefaces, and then I went through the entire book, and I highlighted every single time there was a certain there was one typeface or another typeface in these categories, and also I divided them by language. The reason I did this is because I wanted to see easily the distinction between Yiddish and Hebrew, and to see spatially where Yiddish appeared on the page and where Hebrew appeared on the page. So we have the blue things are Hebrew. So we have the square type is in dark blue, the rabbinic type is in light blue, and then Yiddish type is in pink, but I've put a purple thing over it if it's square type but it's in Yiddish. So as you can see here, there's this says matzahs. This is, a word that comes from the Semitic component, and so they've written it in square type, but it's still in the Yiddish, so I just kind of made it purple rather than blue or pink. And then there's Italian. Italian only appeared on the first page, so it's there, it's green. And then what I did was I went through the entire book and looked at this, and I found that Hebrew was generally in the middle of the page, generally sheltered by these columns. In a kind of sense of, I don't know, when you think of the temple, the construction of the temple, there were, the temple is holy, but then there's a holy of holies. There's there are deeper kind of like inner sanctums, right? We'll have to, where you have the kind of holy thing is protected by this outer vernacular. So the Yiddish is supporting and upholding, but also in the margins. And then you can see at the bottom there, the pink, you can see that it's just Yiddish at the bottom of the page there, and you can, and that then implies that people would have been able to read the Yiddish, even if they couldn't read the Hebrew. The next bit is on pages where it was just kind of split into two columns. This is where I was thinking of the Talmud, because in the Talmud, the less important commentaries are kind of put on the edges, and this is thought to be because when you say go outside in the rain, the stuff on the outside edges, or if the book gets damaged somehow, the stuff on the outside edges would be more likely to get damaged first, and you want to protect the stuff on the inside that's close to the spine. So you can see again here, instead of it just being, as you can see in those Haggadahs, less important language, more important language, less important language, more important language. It's actually more important language is always on the inside, and that's a choice. I think that the Yiddish kind of is on the outside, more liable to be damaged. So just the summary of that is that, of course, Yiddish is marginalized and is protecting Hebrew, the holy tongue, but also Yiddish is more democratic. It's more universal. Just looking at then the pictures in this, I wanted to note the woodcuts looked very similar. I looked at this between two books that I looked at. So there's the one that I looked at, the Digara 1609 one in Venice, and then later in Venice, about 50 years later, in 1663, there was another one from Bragadino, with whom Digara was known to collaborate. And these woodcuts look weirdly similar, but a lot of woodcuts are kind of imitated, but not actually the same. We see this with Goethe's Faust. There was one very famous illustration, and everybody started copying it and trying to make it look exactly the same. But how can you really tell if they're actually the same? Well, you want to overlay them, and you can use Oxford Image Compare software, which is so great. I love it so much. You basically take a picture on your phone of two things, and then it will put them together. It'll put them on top of each other, and it'll either flip back and forth between them, so you can see, oh, suddenly it's missing a shoe or something, or it'll actually, in this case, they've put it. One image is in blue, and one image is in red, and when they're superimposed, it shows black. So this proves to me that these two woodcuts are actually exactly the same, and were probably passed from Digara to Bragadino.
That's really interesting because do you know of the Charlton Hinman and his collator? He was someone who invented this mechanical device, mechanical device, derived from some work he had done in World War II with examining aerial photographs of bombing, and he used it to compare all the then owned copies of Shakespeare's First Folio. At the
yes
you've been to the Folger, you haven't, but
to see if the letters, like sometimes a letter would get corrected.
That's right.
Between one printing
and it would kind of jump out, as it were, when he flipped back and forth the guiding the mirror, I guess. But I mean, imagine not having this, but doing that and hunching over this machine for ages and ages and ages till I completed that work with the comparison to determine the number of the compositors and sort of differentiating them depending on who was more accurate and who wasn't, and so on.
Mm-hmm. In science, this ended up being very important as well because Henrietta Swan Leavitt, who was this woman who was like one of those like women computer people. There was like she was doing like basically the groundwork of science that some guy took credit for. But she was doing this thing where she took photo plates of the night sky and she was comparing them. And she did this so many times that she realized some of the stars were brightening and dimming at equal intervals. And then she realized that actually, depending on how far away they were, or she could tell how far away they were just by their brightness. And she realized that there these things, which are called Cepheid variables, are always the same brightness, and this was used to by Hubble to discover like the size of the universe. So yeah, so comparing images, huge thing for humanity. And huge thing for humanities as well. But yeah, good stuff. If you want, you can the thing online, that link, it's not even an app, it's like a web app, so you can just do this through your phone in your browser, which is awesome. Another thing about the materiality, the reason that I fell in love with this book at first sight was because this is actually printed on parchment, which is unheard of. Letterpress printing does not happen on parchment. It is incredibly difficult. Parchment is not a flat surface, usually. So this was clearly a very high quality edition. Also, getting enough parchment to print a book requires so much planning, like years of planning. Like I'm going to start raising these sheep now so that in 5 years I can make this book. And this is a pretty sizable book. It's bigger than this. Maybe even like this, like. So, when closed. So it's pretty big, and amazing and luxurious, as you can see. There are woodcuts for every page, and it's just so beautiful. So I would imagine this was for a rich client. Something else that's fun about the materiality is this is the page. If we go back here, you can see there's mysterious stains on the page. And this happens to be the page that has the blessing over one of the cups of wine. So for Passover, you're supposed to drink 4 cups of wine. Sometimes people get a little tipsy and then they spill the wine. I've seen it happen at pretty much every Seder I've been at. And this, I think, did actually happen to this book as well. So clearly this was used, and people spilled wine on it. So that's fun. Some of the books in the Oppenheim collection were never touched because Oppenheim was a rabbi. He was the chief rabbi of Prague or something, and people would gift him books, and then he would just put them on a shelf and never use them. But this one's fun because it was used. This isn't technically from the Oppenheim collection, but anyway, fun. Finally, the last part of this project was to have a digital component. We had to, it was a method option, so we could either, figure out how to do paleography or XML encode something. And so I wanted to unite this this print culture with the new world of what is publishing. So I made a digital edition, and you can find it here. And this is what it looks like in the website. So on one side you have my linguistic map. It's not actually the facsimile, it has actually just all of the color coding that I gave it. In the middle is a transcription. I think I only got through the first 3 pages, but I'm now using Transcribus to transcribe the rest of it, so that's exciting. And the fun part about the very first page is actually when you scroll over the words, the lines, it actually, they developed this for my digital edition. When you scroll over the words, it actually highlights on the facsimile where on the page that transcription is. So you can see, oh, here's the Yiddish. The Yiddish is all in the margins. So, good stuff. And you can check that out at that website. And yeah, so I basically give you there the whole summary of that book, everything I've looked into in this book. This work actually led me to my idea for my PhD, which I will be starting in October, back at Oxford, looking at the typography, as I talked about the Herbert Safran's article, Variety in the Typography of Yiddish, and I was like, he missed one that I had right here. And so he probably missed a lot of them, so I'm going to go chase them all down. So I am hoping to create a database that's also based on a machine learning algorithm where I can actually just scan using the Oxford Image Compare software, or using that as the basis, take a picture of any page that will then overlay the letters and see what percent match they are to see if it's actually the same typeface, so I don't have to be sifting through, pages and pages of, oh, is this the same letter? I can instead leave that to the database, take a bunch of pictures, and figure out, the end goal is to figure out the linguistics, to see if the linguistics of Yiddish were changed by who was printing it, where they were printing it, and ultimately what typeface they were using, because that does sometimes change the orthography. So yeah, thank you for having me.